Alright, hello everyone. I'm recording this on the 14th of January, 2026, and this is a recording in response to a video that I was watching this morning where a YouTuber was just talking about this idea about the system and rendering it useless by finding creating workarounds or finding workarounds to the system or the structure that we are all forced to deal with. And I have to admit that when listening to this person describe this idea, they were talking about a lot of things that were familiar to me, although that personally I associate them with a certain period of time in my life when I was in my early 20s. And one of the things that I'm open about on this channel is that when I was 24 years old, I suffered a psychotic break, and that moment created a certain kind of a rupture or it interrupted that kind of lifestyle. And I kind of, part of this, I sort of feel like there is some kind of that part of me that used to live, do more of that stuff. Maybe a lot of this has to do, for one thing, with living in an urban environment as opposed to living in a rural or suburban environment, and in the idea of certain kind of like lifestyle hacks that young people apply to living in an urban environment. And for me, this was introduced basically through friends that worked as bike couriers, and had a very kind of like pedal power, urban, like alternative to gas dependency and all this kind of stuff, environmentalism approach or whatever. And so I personally never I never had the kind of this like die-hard adrenaline junkie attitude enough to really want to become a bike courier myself. But nonetheless, this was kind of like what the scene was like at the time. And there's something about, I guess I might as well start there. The thing is, I honestly don't ride bikes as much as I used to, and part of the reason for that is that due to my, it's not impossible with my disability to ride a bike, but there's something about after having a psychotic break and becoming disabled that I'm less inclined to ride a bike, if that makes any sense. Although if it was complete, like I can make it happen, but there's something about um, the discomfort that I find, let's say, like the feeling of being a young urbanite, riding a bicycle and you're competing in traffic where if you make like the wrong move, you're going to get run over and you're going to die or something like this, or that you've got drivers who specifically hate you for taking up space on the road and treat you with contempt, basically. There's something about, you have to basically, it's not just the physical ability to like pedal up a hill, but you also have to tolerate that kind of level of stress. And I also realized recently that while I was living this lifestyle, I used to eat lunch at a restaurant that was situated in an intersection that had the most accidents in any other place. So it's like basically there's this like constant like background of traffic accidents and danger and all this kind of stuff. And there's something about all this that after a psychotic break, basically I experience life through a state of schizophrenic isolation and withdrawal, and I'm not as kind of extroverted out there doing that stuff anymore. But there's something about all this where the conflict between the people who use the road for cycling versus the people who use the road for cars, and the political issue to use the roads entirely for vehicles, and and also if you notice too, like whether or not you're funding public transit or not, um, or supporting the infrastructure to support alternative forms of transportation, that you can always, just regardless, take your bike, like there's some sort of like psychology where for me it's a lot easier to adopt that lifestyle in a culture where you kind of have the momentum of a lot of other people who are doing the same thing, and so you're kind of feel like you're going with the flow of other people are doing around you, and you're not just kind of like in a constantly going against the grain or in a state of friction. And there's something about all this which is also, I think it could be a personality type thing. Perhaps some people are not inclined to it as much as others, but it is a political issue that requires involvement at a systemic level of infrastructure and planning and civic planning. And it's interesting also with what might happen in the future with new developments such as self-driving cars and stuff like that. Personally, because of my disability and because of the enormous prices around vehicles and gas and stuff like this, I am not really that inclined to drive, and I also don't like. I kind of prefer like a instead of doing this kind of thing where everybody's just gonna like unplug from the system and ride their bikes around. I'd actually like to see more mass transit options or whatever. I should also clarify that I am a Canadian, and I'm kind of seeing this in terms of like the political issue where our equivalent to Donald Trump is Doug Ford, and he has made a like there's basically a contentious issue that he has made where he's trying to like spend all this money to pull out bike lanes in Toronto. So it's like trying to like put money into going backwards, into making it more so basically so that it's harder and harder. Like I basically support this person's perspective, but there's right now at the systemic level there is a systemic infrastructural battle being made to make it more and more and more difficult to do what this young person wants to do, which is to like have a way where you can like independently be kind of independent from the system, which seeks to be all totalizing and all dominating. Where like if you want to be a human being, a person at all, you must drive a car, you must have a driver's license, you must shop at this store, you must have an Amazon Prime account, all this kind of stuff, right? So this person was giving a list of tips, things you could do to subvert the system, such as boycotting Amazon, canceling your Amazon Prime subscription, not using social media, all that kind of stuff. And these are things that I'm sympathetic with, that I have been doing myself, or at least I have been living with my family and my sister, at least, who is a much more of a Amazon shopper than me, who is the one who got the subscription in the first place, has decided to cancel it. And I have to admit, this is one of the things where it's like, when it comes to this, there's something funny about it, because it's like, oftentimes, when it comes to Amazon, it's this thing where there is a collective, like a family account shared by a family or shared by a group of people. And I have always, I don't know, I flip flop, right? Sometimes I flip flop and I buy stuff off Amazon. And what I realize though is that I basically do support this basic principle of boycotting Amazon, but I would like to also just contribute a this observation that I've had with using Amazon, in that I think people sort of mistakenly, even though Amazon is obviously a very huge business that is very threatening to local businesses, small businesses and stuff like that. There's this, if you are to take Amazon seriously as a kind of like everything store, where you could, like, if you went the other way and you were going to say, instead of shopping at all these other places, what if I did the opposite and I just got everything from Amazon? If you were to just, for as a hypothetical, go in the complete opposite direction, you might start realizing that there's certain things that Amazon is good for, and there's certain things that Amazon is not good for. And when you consider what Amazon is good for versus what it's not good for example, like I have if I have a pair of headphones that I've had for a number of years, and I wanted to, the headphones work fine, but the earmuffs wear out. If I went to my local retailer and I was going to look for replacement earmuffs, they'd be like, "We don't have. You have to just buy a new pair of headphones, right?" But if you wanted to replace individual parts on your headphones, like the earmuffs wore out, you can do that on Amazon, right? And so this is like, there's a tricky kind of thing here, because it could very well be that, like, in the good intentions to boycott Amazon and all this kind of stuff, you might actually end up being more wasteful, because if you have things that break your own, I don't know, unless you have a certain fixer culture. Like, even this is the whole thing, is if you have a fixer culture, you could develop a repair culture, a DIY repair culture, where you, instead of just buying things, breaking them, buying more things, you could create a culture of repairing consumer items, but nonetheless, you would need somewhere to source your parts, right? And one of the things, like, to be a devil's advocate for Amazon, is that you could, what Amazon is useful for is that if you wanted to just replace, like, for example, I'm just using this as an example with the earmuffs. Another example would be, I have, like, Xbox controllers that I use for playing video games. And when the battery pack, if you have the batteries in the battery pack and they become corroded and they become damaged, instead of having to buy a whole new controller, you can get replacement battery packs off Amazon for fairly cheap. And if you were to go to, could you do the same, find the same thing if you went to Walmart, or Radio Shack doesn't exist anymore, or any other retailer that would have the same. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, the first of all, if you were going to even approach that problem from going to a brick and mortar retailer, you may not even know where you would go in the first place, and then you might have to waste a whole lot of time phoning around or trying out different places, when you could just get the thing really easy off Amazon. And then, so there's this kind of thing where I think I hate to say, I think Amazon may actually be useful for something, but at the same time, imagine all these kinds of things that if you were to just buy everything off Amazon, where would it fall short? There are actually a lot of things which, if you want to buy something, that you can't find it on Amazon. And that this is the whole thing, is that I think people kind of misunderstand what Amazon is, because they think it's just like this everything store that could technically replace the whole economy. Is like anything you could buy is now just something you can buy off Amazon. But the thing is, in my experience, if you want to buy, like, replacement parts for consumer electronics, it's really good. But if you want to buy, like, I don't know. I mean, I'm disappointed by trying to track down things like obscure art house movies or something. Like, if I want to order, like, a copy of, like, Zardoz off Amazon Prime, you don't have. How do you not have Zardoz? You don't even have Zardoz streaming. Like, this is basically, like, the things what it's good for is replacing the earmuffs in my headphones, but supplying me with the content that I'm looking for, maybe not, right? So this is kind of how like, I don't think Amazon itself is. I think by having this narrow-minded thing, like, we're just going to boycott entirely, that there could be other options where you could make use of these things in a different context, which promotes a kind of a repair culture, perhaps, right? Or that even if we need to basically come up with ideas of Amazon alternatives for sourcing different parts to repair things, or because I think that is what's helpful, because it's a marketplace that I don't think existed in another form. Like, you wouldn't be able to go to Radio Shack and get all the individual components to replace your consumer electronics, but now you can do that with Amazon, right? And that, obviously, like, if you're saying everybody don't, rather than using vehicles, just ride bikes around, this obviously is a certain form of ableism that requires you to have a certain capacity to ride a bike, and it's not accessible for everybody. And so there's also this whole thing, when you apply this to things like social media or Google. I've heard from other people that have disabilities that it's sort of one of these things where it's like a kind of a no-brainer. Like using the internet is just simple and easy from a like your Chromebook, Google Chrome, like kind of your really basic perspective. But then you're kind of like giving yourself over to like the Google control society or whatever by doing this. But like people who have disabilities don't have the resources to kind of subvert that in the same way that it might be really easy to just do like one-click shopping on Amazon, but people might not have the capacity to find alternatives to this. So there's that disability aspect to it. There's also this thing around the way that new apps and have disrupted industries. There's the whole disruption industry of things like Uber, which I don't think the person really mentioned because they were mainly just talking about the bikes. But I think it's also important to bring in the conversation about Uber and taxis, and that apparently one of these things that I've noticed about this is that personally I've never used Uber before, and I do have a friend in Australia who works as a taxi driver, and there's obviously a big problem around Uber where the taxi company does this thing where they supply the car for the taxi driver, and there's a whole kind of taxi union system and all this kind of stuff. And in contrast to that, Uber represents a very kind of like stripped down gig economy where people aren't given the same benefits and they're expected to supply their own car. And so if your car has mechanical issues, they're expected to do their own maintenance and all this kind of stuff. It's a different system to provide the same service to the user. And one of the things about this that I have noticed is that the Uber requires you to have a newer quality, a newer phone. I have a pretty old school iPhone, and instead of upgrading my iPhone to a new one, I decided to replace the battery on it. I was able to replace the battery on my iPhone for $60, which is about the price if I wanted to buy a double LP vinyl reissue of a classic, 1990s, pop album or something like that, like Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. I could spend $60 on like a reissue of The Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails, or like some sort of MF Doom album or something, or else I could spend that money to revive my phone, just $60, rather than spending all this money on a new iPhone. But one of the limitations I've noticed is that if I wanted to use the Uber app, I would have to upgrade to a whole new phone. So it's like I have to spend all this money to be able to even access this service, which then doesn't support the workers with as many benefits, and it creates a more precarious system for the worker. And it was only apparently competitive in the early days, where there's this business model where you disrupt the industry by making it really competitive, but then once you've eliminated your competition, then you can just reset it back so that it's just as expensive as the old taxi services once were. And it's like, the thing about this is that, so I have to jump through the hoop of upgrading my phone to even access. Why don't I just fucking not do this in the first place, right? Another example of this is that I have prescriptions that I need in order to fill my prescriptions, I was doing this on the phone, and my sister said, well, why don't you use the app for it? And I'm like, well, why don't I not use the app for it, right? Because there's this whole thing is that, like, there's this kind of idea that there's this structure that basically, one of the things that I'm annoyed by is that if you're creating a system where every person absolutely apparently needs to have a goddamn fucking cell phone to do anything, like your whole life is going to be run through an app, right? Then why the fuck do I have to pay for it, right? Like, why isn't this, like, if you can't have a bank account, if you can't have a prescription, if you can't have a doctor's appointment, if you can't have a taxi, if you can't do fucking anything, then why is this something that I even have to pay for in the first place, right? And this is, so basically um, I don't know. This is a pet peeve. I think that there's a certain kind of appeal to systems which are accessible through dial-up telephone, where if you want to refill your prescription, you call the number and you type in your prescription number, and you don't. Why would I need to download an app for this? Why would I need to buy a new phone? Why would I need to reorganize my cell phone plan? Why would I need to why would I need to consume more? Why would I need to buy more stuff? There's this book that I read as a kid called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and it describes a society that is like highly advanced, but it's basically this the fear that everybody has of like transhumanism, because I don't think people don't reproduce through having sex with each other. It's all done through like genetic engineering or something like that. And it's like people have elaborate drugs to make them comfortable all the time. And then when for entertainment, they have like sports that require like outrageous amounts of equipment. Like everything, like the idea is that you're living this highly advanced society, but like everything that you do, you need to have enormous amount of bureaucratic licensing for, an enormous amount of special equipment, all this kind of. Nobody can just kind of like live a simple, natural life and do things for themselves. You have to be like, oh, I need to have the latest issue model of like the Go Fuck Yourself machine or whatever, right? Sorry, I haven't upgraded to the newest operating system of I can't live my fucking life. Give me a goddamn break. Operate, So it's like this is like you have to like buy into this whole stupid techno structure to be like, I've got like the huge like football player helmet and the big pads and a whole team of cheerleaders jacking me off, and like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, you need to have this big massive like bloated system that you buy into and support through everything that you do, and you can just like there's this to opt out of that basically, right? And so one way, but the thing is, it's like you don't have to I'm choosing to do it in a way where instead of buying a new cell phone, I'm just going to buy a new battery, right? And I'm not going to do all my fucking things on apps, but you know what I'm trying to say? But I think that there's a sort of argument to be made for like, if you guys really want to create this structure, instead of being like creating a system where we're going to be like, or like instead of trying to live so like off the grid, like maybe it would be helpful to not give up on having a system, instead have a system where like instead of having the cell phone thing being a private entity corporation that is constantly like, I'm getting a thing where I got a pretty good deal worked out where I pay under $30 a month, but they're always like, no, you need to have like some sort of the latest and greatest equipment, and so you need to be, so that you can be using these apps that we've got this system that exploits the work. Like, you're gonna pay all this money to basically go to some big tech giant and exploit the worker, rather than just calling up a taxi cab on your fucking dial-up phone and then paying into a system that gives people like actual benefits and workers protections, right? And it's like, instead of living in fucking Mad Max world, like, there's a certain in-between where I think actually having a bit of a system is a good thing. Like a system where if you want to if you want to create a DIY repair culture, it's better to have like a system where you know who to call to get the spare part so you can repair something for your neighbor so they don't have to go and buy a new one, and have that system work coherently rather than just being like, lost in a kind of an off-grid feral kind of chaos state, basically, right? And then from this, I think, there's other things I can bring in, like the topic of dumpster diving, which, to be fair, I am a Canadian, and I experienced the most dumpster diving culture when I was living in Australia, in Melbourne. But there's something about the culture in Australia versus the culture in Canada, and then I can only imagine what the culture in America is like. I've only ever been like, I've only ever been basically to Seattle to go see some bands play, right? I don't go to America very much. In Melbourne, they have a place called the Victoria Markets, um, and in the Victoria Markets, they have fruit stands, vegetable stands, places where you can go to buy produce, and the stuff that is, let's say, tomatoes that are bruised or maybe on the verge of going off, or things that are subpar, the all the stuff that gets thrown out that's subpar quality is, if you just turn the corner and look behind the person's stall, it's you could like just stick your hand in and grab it with the person looking at you, and they won't stop you, right? There's some sort of like culture there where, like, if that's what you are inclined to do, they're not going to like slap your hand with a ruler and say tisk tisk. If you, they'll say, oh, you want some more? We got some more over here, right? And so there's a culture, and then but then that's different than going to the Woolworths or the Safeway behind the thing and trying to dig around in a dumpster. There is a certain level of danger that is involved in this, because there could be broken glass or something like that. And when you go to the market, it's a kind of a classier experience, and it's sort of socially normalized in that culture. But then when you're trying to rummage around in the back, you're also probably going to find a lot of stuff that is like, you know what I like? Have you ever had like these Twinkies or wagon wheels, or just like a bunch of fucking bullshit that's probably not good for you, and that maybe it would be best if it was just left in that dumpster? You're gonna have to like, you might get some good stuff, but you're gonna have a lot of garbage, right? Now, the thing about this is that in Vancouver, we have, in British Columbia, we have a homeless population that is basically, because BC has better weather than the rest of Canada, and it's also not America. There's probably a lot of people that come to Vancouver and other places from, or all sorts of places, to live as homeless people. And because of this, and also like there's a huge drug problem, huge crime problem, all that kind of stuff. And because of just the high concentration of this, like I don't think we have exactly the same culture here that I experienced in Melbourne, because what we have ended up with in Nanaimo anyways is a fairly robust food recovery program that is essentially run by Christian charity organizations, but they have to avoid the fact of having a bunch of people digging through their dumpsters. They have a organized system of food redistribution, but you have to like sign up with them and have a card and all this. You have to be, it's a system, right? So this is the problem about, like, this is basically, I guess you could say, why example. I don't know if the difference that I'm talking about is like why I'm not an anarchist. I've never done anything where I've announced myself as an anarchist, but I think there's a certain like young kids in their 20s who are very into like, punk rock and anarchy and like food not bombs or all this kind of, and dumpster diving and stuff like this. I'm a millennial. I'm going to be approaching my 40s soon, and I'm living with my parents. I feel like I'm in this situation, obviously, where I feel like I'm squeezed into a fairly kind of milquetoast liberal kind of life, just based on having to put up with my family, living with my family. Right? The problem about this is I'm more sympathetic towards having a good system, or a system that actually helps or that works in a certain way, and not just being like, oh, the system is corrupt, we can't fix it, so we need to we need to just live completely outside of it, right? But there is this thing that I have to say, that like, um, I think there's a certain kind of privilege that I had to be able to like take advantage of a period of time when couch surfing was still a thing. Um, because like I think the idea is like couch surfing versus Airbnb, right? And at least nowadays, our government here in Canada has made some laws that sort of crack down on the Airbnb thing. But there was this like weird golden age where before people got the idea in their heads that they could just use Airbnb to just like really leverage their real estate in the economy, that people had this sort of idealistic kind of like free living attitude where people just open their doors to like random strangers for like out in the spirit of like subverting the system, right? Because there's a certain kind of joy that like it was actually like people, this is what you have to understand. It's like if you're living your life in such a way where your only motivation is like the dollar sign and money, and that there's like something you might think about this and be like, it's just stupid that people would have an opportunity to make so much money off of people, and yet instead they just open their doors for strangers to just subvert the whole monetary system. And but it's like there's something about it where it's like that was actually the idea. That was the whole idea. Was people thought had a kind of but this is, and I thought this is interesting because a lot of times people talk about, there seems to be this sort of retrospective historical thing where people are talking about millennial optimism. And as a millennial, I don't know if it's like, in the post 9/11 era, it wasn't very optimistic, okay? In the post 2008 financial crisis, it wasn't very optimistic. But there was this sort of window of opportunity, I think, everything, before the whole idea of what the internet could be, of what these new technologies could be, of what the new potentials for the future could be, where people were like, well, we have the opportunity to do everything, where it's not just completely the bottom line is the dollar sign, and if you're not exploiting people for as much money as possible, how can you, oh, wait a minute, we have all these opportunities to just fucking squeeze money out of people, how can we just relentlessly do this as much as possible? People actually kind of like enjoyed subverting that whole thing, right? And in some way, it's encouraging to see that the spirit is still out there, but I feel like it's kind of problematic because the whole idea is that people are saying, like, I don't know, when I was younger, I used to go to Value, another one was thrift shopping, going to Value Village and stuff like this. Unfortunately, Value Village is now owned by Walmart, right? Value Village in America, I think, and Australia is called Savers, right? And also, with most thrift stores, you have to look at there's a hospital auxiliary thrift store will raise money to support your local hospital, right? And this is the thing, is like, even though we have public health care, we still have thrift stores working as charities as an auxiliary support for our public health care system here, right? So there's this thing like that where, like, okay, sure, shopping at those kinds of places will put the money into a certain charity, but then if you shop at other charity shops like the Salvation Army or I don't know, you have to look at each of the actual charity shops you're shopping at and consider, is this really like, is the charity as good as they say they are? And then you have to like, is it, or like there's a whole secondhand market that might not be a thrift store, but it might be like buying secondhand clothes from somebody else who's selling them, or you know what I'm trying to say? Or there's the idea of the secondhand clothes also commodified in boutiques, right? Because this was the question where the problem too about the secondhand clothing is that as a millennial, there was a period of time where you went to Value Village and you would expect to go through the t-shirt rack and be like, every t-shirt is $2, $3, and I'm talking Canadian here. And now inflation has inflated the secondhand market at thrift stores, and they're now been bought up by Walmart and these big mega corporations. So like, you think you're going to be like subverting the system by shopping at a thrift store, by like you're going to buy something secondhand rather than going to like Old Navy or something. It could just be owned by a corporation that's just as bad as the people who are selling it new, right? And then the other thing about this is that thrift shopping itself is a kind of a labor, right? Or it's you could think it like as a hobby, something to do, on your day off to spend some time. But to be honest, if you get down to brass tacks, it takes work to take a whole thrift store and to be like, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to pick through it meticulously and find the thing that I like and I'm going to buy this. And the one you got to understand about thrift store is that with other stores, because when you buy new clothes, if you buy the cool thing, there's more of that new thing for other people to buy. If you go to a thrift store and there's only one thing of that cool thing and you buy it, then the more that hip young people do this, they basically strip the secondhand market of all the cool stuff. And then by you doing that and then telling everybody else to do it, there's not going to be very much good stuff there, right? What I'm trying to say, and then like it actually the point is that you're going to be like spending people are going to be spending more time being like, oh man, well, before I used to spend 1 hour picking through stuff and I found some cool stuff. Now I have to spend 2 hours or 3 hours, and you've got a bunch of young people, instead of doing something that could actually help somebody, you're wasting all this time looking, and then you're depleting a limited market of whatever's cool, and then telling everybody else to do the same thing until there's nothing left. And then meanwhile, where does all the new stuff come from? It still comes from people doing fucking slave labor, and the new clothes have to come from somewhere, right? And at one point in time, as a millennial, you would go to the thrift store and it would be like all the quirky vintage stuff from the 80s and the 70s and be like, oh, it's like retro nostalgia. Now, it's just like you're going to go to the thrift store in 2026 and you're going to find some clothing from 2016 and it's going to be like, fuck, the history is over, culture is over, there's no nostalgia, there's no sentimental longing for the past. It's like you're just buying somebody else's old shit and most of it sucks, and so you're just gonna pick through whatever's cool and then just tell everybody, and then meanwhile, can we just fucking organize? Like this is not a good way to resist. I'm sorry, there's also, okay, where I've got thrift shopping, I've got talking about dumpster diving, I'm talking about bikes, Uber, Amazon Prime, couch surfing, and Airbnb. The other one to mention is, I'll close on the last note on the topic of hitchhiking. And I think that the topic of hitchhiking illustrates the problem with this beautifully, because obviously there's a certain danger involved with hitchhiking, because you could be picked up by a serial killer or something like this, right? And because of this, there is an attitude of extreme fear and insecurity that nobody, or most normal people, don't feel safe enough to just stick their thumb out on the side of the road and expect that a stranger is going to pick them up to get from point A to point B. And because they don't have this trust, what they're dependent on is a whole system of where they have to be very independent, drive their own car, do this, or that they're dependent on the government to provide a public transit system, or you're dependent on a precarious gig worker economy. The thing about this is that there's this whole system that has a rampant problem of people not trusting each other, creating a society that is fundamentally, at its core, paranoid, unsafe, untrusting, suspicious. People don't know their neighbors. People don't trust their children to just go out on the street on their own. People don't trust just a random stranger to give you a ride somewhere. Basically, everybody around you could be a murderer, a rapist, a perverted freak, a maniac, all this kind of stuff. And because we live in a society where we don't trust each other, we don't feel safe, what we need a strong police force so that if anybody makes you feel comfortable, we have an immediate mediation provided by the state. And the problem about this is that at most progressive people, the thing about this is we are nowhere near anywhere where we be able to not have a police force, right? And that even people who are liberal, progressive, who may, this is the whole thing. Like, there's this whole problem controversy around progressive politics, around people who want to defund the police, who want to get away from this whole mentality, who want to we want to create a, like, the idea is that instead of having a society where everybody's afraid of each other, who basically, instead of assuming the people around you are people that you can trust, you assume that people around you are criminals, are hostile, or people are going to take advantage of you or harm you, and that we need police to protect us from each other, right? This is basically, even people who are progressive, basically, this is the reality that they affirm. Nobody's affirming a reality where you have a community of people that you trust, that you feel safe around, we all need a police to basically create a system where we're all subjects of this control, because we don't trust ourselves. We don't trust ourselves. We don't trust each other, and we need the police to do this for us, basically, right? And so in the same way that we can't, if you wanted to, there's all these sorts of really basic things that, if in the same way that we don't know how to live without police, if you wanted to get from point A to point B, you're dependent on having a driver's license, you're dependent on having a car, you're dependent on having an insurance policy, you're dependent on having a whole driver's history, you're dependent on having a credit system, you're a financing, a mortgage, a bank, a social insurance, you're dependent on, this whole system is propped up because basically we can't even step outside of our door, right? We have to be like, I need to be in a big, expensive mechanical bubble, or else the person who I walk past on the street might fucking stab me, and then I need to have a police person to make sure that all the people on the street are safe people that I can trust, and that I in order to tell who people, we're going to have to racial profile everybody, right? This is basically the system that we've created. And that the problem is, even the most progressive liberal people are basically living their life in a state of fear and paranoia, where that they need the police to do this for them, right? And I think that there's nothing more explicit. Like, imagine if the bus system went down. Imagine if the transit system went down. Imagine if everything went down, and we now lived in a society where you were if you wanted to get somewhere, you would have to negotiate with a human being who didn't have the stamp of approval of the state, as like, the state has accepted me as a trustworthy bus driver. No, you're gonna have to negotiate with some random freak. You don't know if this person is going to fucking rape and murder you, or if they're going to get you there at punctual time, right? Like, this is basically, we don't trust each other, and like the point is that we create the system where, like, okay, the police are the people we can trust because we have faith in the system. But what if the police what if the police are the people that are going to fuck you up, because, like, we have this false sense of security that we just think that the authority is right by default, because the system of authority has checks and balances that makes it that way, that the system that you can get on a bus and you can trust that your bus driver isn't going to kill you, right? This is why I think it's better to have better to support, to do what we can to maintain a system that we trust, that works for people, that provides access for everybody, not just a bunch of, we're like, oh, you can't ride the bus anymore because the bus driver is a homicidal maniac, everybody has to ride bikes, or else, it's like survival of the fittest, or else, this is why my complaint against that way of doing things. Okay, thanks for listening. I don't know. This is a one-off recording. If you have any input, I'd like to hear what you have to say in the comments. Good luck out there, everyone.